In 1348, as the Black Death swept across Europe, cities scrambled to create emergency institutions they called hospitals. But these weren't centers of healing as we understand them today. They were makeshift containment facilities where overwhelmed staff struggled to care for the sick under catastrophic conditions. Inside their walls, the atmosphere was suffocating. Dim light, overcrowding, and a lack of sanitation created a space where hope was rare and fear was constant. The medical understanding of the time was rooted in spiritual and humoral theories, and plague hospitals became the setting for treatment shaped more by belief than by biology. Nearly half of Europe's population perished during the 4-year pandemic, and these institutions stood at the center of one of history's most devastating public health collapses. Rather than relief, many treatments intensified patient suffering. With no concept of bacteria, infection control, or disease transmission, even the best intentions often led to worsening outcomes. The result was a landscape of well-meaning interventions that frequently caused more harm than help, all under the banner of medicine. Medieval plague hospitals were often constructed in haste, their primary function not to heal, but to isolate. Built from heavy stone, with narrow windows and limited ventilation, these structures resembled fortified prisons more than places of care. Their design reflected a desire to contain illness, not to comfort the ill. Inside, basic necessities were in short supply. Patients often rested on straw mats laid across the floor, without individual bedding or privacy. As more people fell ill, space ran out and new arrivals were placed wherever there was room, sometimes directly beside others already weakened by the disease. Ventilation was poor and fresh air rarely circulated through the tightly sealed interiors. The very architecture, though intended to protect the healthy from exposure, created an environment in which stagnant air and overcrowding increased the spread of illness. The lack of understanding about contagion meant that proximity, contaminated surfaces, and shared water sources inadvertently created new chains of transmission. Even the water supply could become compromised. In some facilities, wells were dug too close to areas used for waste disposal or temporary body storage, leading to contamination. The structure that was meant to shelter the sick often became an unintentional amplifier of risk. Still, it was not just the buildings themselves that intensified suffering, but the methods of treatment practiced within. Among the most common medical responses to the plague was bloodletting, a practice rooted in the belief that illness stemmed from an imbalance of bodily humors. Physicians sought to restore equilibrium by removing what they called corrupted blood, hoping it would relieve symptoms and prevent further decline. The instruments used were basic and imprecise. Metal blades or specially crafted lancets applied to the skin to draw blood. Treatments followed detailed schedules based on long-standing theories, often informed by astrology and humoral charts. Physicians watched closely for changes in the blood's color or flow, interpreting these shifts as signs of progress or danger. Leeches gathered from ponds and marshes were also applied as a gentler alternative. Though not sterile by modern standards, they were seen as valuable tools for controlling the body's internal state. Some physicians believed that leeches could detect areas of the body most affected by illness, would naturally gravitate to those places, offering targeted relief. Despite these intentions, bloodletting was often applied to already fragile patients, and outcomes varied widely. In many cases, individuals grew weaker after treatment, but the practice remained widespread, not out of cruelty, but from a genuine, if flawed, attempt to save lives with the knowledge available at the time. It was one of many procedures that reflected both the hope and the helplessness of medieval medicine. The most visible symptom of bubonic plague was the sudden swelling of lymph nodes, known at the time as buboes. These swellings often appeared near the neck, groin, or armpits, and were seen as a physical manifestation of internal corruption. To medieval physicians, these signs demanded immediate intervention. A wide range of remedies was applied directly to the swollen areas. Herbal pastes made from plant roots and resins were common, intended to draw out harmful substances. Some mixtures included ingredients thought to have symbolic or balancing properties, though their actual effectiveness was limited. These applications reflected both the natural medicine of the time and spiritual beliefs about illness and purification. When external treatments appeared ineffective, physicians sometimes turned to more invasive approaches. Believing that draining the affected areas would release the cause of the illness, they attempted minor incisions with basic surgical tools. These tools, lacking modern hygiene standards, carried obvious risks, but at the time the practice was seen as an act of courage and hope. In some texts, extreme methods were even proposed, such as ingesting small amounts of the substance removed from buboes, in the belief that the body could build tolerance. Though it's unclear how widely such ideas were applied in practice, they illustrate the level of desperation in facing an unknown, rapidly spreading disease. Behind these treatments lay a fundamental truth. Medieval physicians were doing their best to respond to an overwhelming crisis, using the only tools and theories they had. In their minds, these efforts were acts of healing, not harm. In medieval medicine, the study of urine, known as uroscopy, was one of the most respected diagnostic tools. Physicians believed that nearly every internal condition could be detected through careful analysis of its color, clarity, and sediment. Patients' urine was collected in glass flasks and examined by candlelight, with each variation carefully recorded. Charts and reference guides were widely used, assigning meanings to shades of yellow, red, or brown. These interpretations guided not only diagnosis but also treatment plans, which were adjusted based on how the urine appeared over time. Though it offered no real insight into bacterial infection, uroscopy reflected a sincere attempt to understand the body's internal state. Some treatments involved bathing in special solutions believed to purify the skin and balance internal energies. Substances like vinegar, rosewater, and herbal infusions were added to bathing water in the hopes of reducing fever or cleansing the body of harmful humors. While these methods had no effect on the plague itself, they may have provided brief moments of comfort to those enduring extreme illness. Medieval texts also mention the symbolic use of bodily fluids in treatments, a concept born from spiritual and alchemical thinking. These ideas seem alien today, but they were part of a broader worldview in which illness was a reflection of imbalance not just within the body, but within the universe. Emphasis on liquids, whether as diagnostic tools or therapeutic substances, revealed how deeply interconnected physical, spiritual, and environmental factors were in the medical logic of the time. In the 14th century, many physicians believed that disease traveled through the air as invisible clouds of corruption, a theory known as miasma. According to this view, bad smells carried illness from person to person, seeping into the body through the lungs and skin. Plague hospitals were designed with this belief in mind, often with heavy walls and limited airflow to contain the air and prevent its escape. Ironically, these architectural choices had the opposite effect. By sealing off ventilation and isolating the sick in poorly circulated spaces, the stagnant air allowed disease to spread more efficiently. Patients and staff alike breathed in the same enclosed atmosphere day after day, unaware that fresh air, not confinement, might have helped more. To fight miasma, physicians burned strong-smelling substances like herbs, sulfur, or pitch. They hoped that the smoke would cleanse the environment and restore balance. Rooms would be filled with dense fumes, and windows often remained closed during these sessions. While well-intentioned, these practices sometimes made it harder to breathe and created additional stress for those already weakened by illness. Herbal sachets were another common defense. Carried around the neck or held under the nose, they were believed to ward off contaminated air. Though harmless, these objects reflected a desperate need to feel some control over an otherwise uncontrollable illness. The miasma theory dominated medical thinking for centuries. Though incorrect, it reveals how medieval society tried to understand and confront invisible threats, using whatever knowledge, tradition, or intuition they had. In plague-era Europe, medicine was inseparable from the stars. Physicians often consulted astrological charts before beginning treatment, believing that planetary alignments influenced not just human behavior, but the course of disease. Hospitals, too, followed this logic, with schedules, procedures, and even diagnoses shaped by celestial movement. Horoscopes were cast for patients upon arrival, and medical decisions were timed according to the positions of the moon, planets, and constellations. Certain treatments were only performed on specific days or under favorable astrological conditions. This meant that some patients waited days for the right moment, even as their condition worsened. Bloodletting, for instance, was tied to lunar cycles. Physicians believed that the moon's pull influenced the flow of fluids in the body, and that purging should happen only when gravitational forces aligned properly. Herbal treatments, too, were prescribed according to planetary symbolism. An herb linked to Mars might be used for fevers, while one associated with Venus was thought to soothe the heart or emotions. Patients were sometimes categorized based on zodiac signs, with treatments adjusted to match perceived elemental affinities. People born under water signs might be advised to avoid heat-based remedies, while those under fire signs might be steered toward cooling solutions. These ideas had little to do with symptoms and everything to do with celestial interpretation. Though modern science has long since abandoned such methods, astrological medicine reflected a deep desire to find order in chaos. Faced with a disease they couldn't explain, medieval physicians looked to the skies for answers and acted on what they saw. The Black Death overwhelmed not only the living, but also the systems meant to record and respond to death. Plague hospitals became the front lines of the struggle, where survival was rare and loss became routine. For administrators, physicians, and attendants, calendar day was as much a necessity as providing care. In some of the better documented cases, hospitals tracked admissions and outcomes with surprising precision. Records show that even the most advanced institutions often lost over half their patients, while smaller or hastily constructed hospitals saw survival rates drop far lower. These statistics offer a stark view of a time when medical systems were pushed far beyond their limits. Daily tallies were kept on wooden boards or parchment, marking the growing burden of the disease. As the numbers rose, hospital staff faced a grim logistical challenge: how to manage the remains with dignity and efficiency. Graveyards quickly reached capacity, and mass burial sites were created to accommodate the rise in toll. In the absence of modern protective gear or understanding of contagion, medical workers were among the most vulnerable. Many contracted the disease themselves and died while performing their duties. Hospitals often saw entire teams replaced multiple times during a single outbreak, creating instability and further straining the system. These challenges weren't limited to patient care. They affected every aspect of hospital operation, from resource management to morale. Even the process of documenting the dead became emotionally and physically exhausting, as the sheer volume of loss reshaped the daily rhythm of life inside plague facilities. As the plague continued to spread and treatments proved ineffective, even the institutions built to fight the disease began to collapse. Resources ran dry, morale eroded, and the fear that once hovered outside hospital walls crept inside. Eventually, some plague hospitals were left nearly empty, not because patients recovered, but because those who cared for them could no longer continue. The abandonment of these hospitals did not always come with warning. In some cases, physicians and staff quietly slipped away, unable to face the daily toll or fearful for their own lives. Those too weak to leave remained behind, isolated in rooms where care had stopped, but suffering had not. In larger cities, containment measures led to difficult decisions. Hospitals were sealed to prevent the spread of disease, leaving patients inside without ongoing support. While intended as a public safety measure, these closures often meant that anyone left behind was effectively cut off from aid. Within the walls, the absence of structure led to chaos. Supplies dwindled, cleanliness deteriorated, and the sense of purpose that had sustained many workers vanished. Survivors later described scenes of confusion, silence, and neglect, the gradual unraveling of a system that had once tried, however imperfectly, to provide hope. When the worst passed and cities reopened these places, what they found were empty beds, faded records, and buildings scarred by crisis. The physical remains of the plague hospitals became silent monuments to a time when society struggled to respond to a disaster it did not yet understand. The plague hospitals of medieval Europe remain some of history's most haunting medical landmarks, not because of cruelty, but because of how little was understood. These institutions were built out of necessity, staffed by people who genuinely sought to help, and guided by the medical knowledge of their time. Yet, in their effort to save lives, they often amplified suffering through treatments we now know to be ineffective or harmful. At their core, plague hospitals reflected the intersection of fear, faith, and science in a world that had no tools to explain what was happening. The reliance on spiritual theories, elemental imbalances, and celestial timing wasn't negligence. It was the only framework available. Within that framework, every action was an attempt at controlling the face of chaos. Today, many of these buildings still stand, Their heavy stone walls and narrow windows reminders of a time when survival was uncertain and every cough could signal catastrophe. Walking through them, it's possible to sense the urgency that once filled those halls, the desperate efforts to care, to understand, and to endure. Modern medicine, with its reliance on data, testing, and prevention, offers a powerful contrast. Diseases that once devastated continents can now be managed with early intervention and targeted treatment. The very existence of this progress highlights just how far we've come and how much we owe to the lessons, failures, and sacrifices of those who came before. The legacy of medieval plague hospitals is not just one of pain, but of transformation. They remind us that science evolves, that care must adapt, and that even the darkest chapters in history carry within them the roots of future progress.